Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have a very special, very young woman, Nadia Ragozhina, born in Russia with an amazing story. Please leave the questions to the end and use either the chat room or the raised hand. You know what to do. Nadia Ragozhina was born in Moscow and moved to the UK in 2000. She's a senior journalist at BBC World News. Worlds Apart is her first book. Two brothers grow up in the Jewish streets of Warsaw. At the turn of the 20th century, they moved home and never saw each other again. 100 years later, Marcus's great-granddaughter, Nadia Ragozhina, rediscovers the missing part of her broken family. Could she piece together the stories hidden for generations? Their daughters and granddaughters are set against the Russian Revolution, Stalin's repressions, and the persecution of Jews across Europe and the Second World War. So over to Nadia.
Hi, thank you so much, David. Right, so I'm just trying to fix my screen. I'm seeing the chat for some reason, but I'm just going to ignore it. Also, Phil, could you spotlight me so I'm seeing myself when I'm talking rather than someone else? Is that okay?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you. So this is the book. This is Worlds Apart. I hope that I will do it justice and that you will want to. Oh, this is perfect. I've got it now. Thanks. That I can tell you all about it, and I will be able to. I will answer your questions towards the end as well. I'll make sure there's enough room for that. So, as David was saying, Marcus and Adolf. This is Marcus. This is Adolf. This is Marcus. Marcus was my great-grandfather. They grew up in Warsaw and they went their separate ways, and they didn't know that they were never going to see each other again. Adolf left first. They were in Warsaw in 1905. Adolf left, and I'm sure you will know that. Oh, I'm going to show you the photo as well straight away, so you know you can have a better look at them. There you go. Adolf left because Warsaw was going through a very difficult time in 1905. One of the rounds of pogroms were just finishing. There was a lot of instability. There were not enough jobs. He had just got married. He wanted to start a family, and his new wife was called Marie Malach, and her sister was already living in Switzerland. And so she said to them, come to Switzerland. She had settled in the Jura mountainous area and in a small village, and she said to them, there are lots of watch factories here and there are jobs. So it wasn't quite what Adolf had in mind when he was already studying at the university in Warsaw, and he wanted to do something else. He definitely wanted education is what he was craving, but I think stability was more important at that point. So they went and they settled in a small village in the Jura mountains, and his life kind of took off from there. Whereas Marcus stayed behind, and that's one of the big mysteries, is we don't really know why he stayed behind. I know that he had his elderly mother to look after, but also from all the research I've done, everything I've been able to learn about my great-grandfather, I think he didn't really know what to do with his life, and so he stayed behind doing odd jobs, kind of just waiting for the next opportunity. And what happened is that quite a few, almost more than a decade later, the First World War started, and he enlisted and joined the Russian Imperial Army. And both brothers had already been socialists, so they were quite political and they were following what was happening. But I think Marcus was an idealist. And so during his time in the Russian army, in the Russian Imperial Army, his kind of socialist leanings turned into more Bolshevik communist leanings. And so towards the end of the war, after the war was over, he moved to Moscow because for him, he wanted a break from the past. His mother had died at the end of the First World War, so he didn't have any more attachments to his hometown, and so he left, went to Moscow, and was looking forward to building a completely different life for himself. And we're going to talk. So obviously, this is the split. This is how the two families went in their separate ways. I was born in Moscow. My grandmother, who is 98 and lives in London, she is Marcus's daughter. So she was born in 1923 in Moscow when Lenin was still alive and had a year left to live. And Marcus's life is very interesting because he was an idealist. He chose his path for himself, and at the beginning it was going really well. Lenin had so Russia went through several horrific years of the civil war. It was a very unstable time, but afterwards, to give a kickstart to the economy and to kind of make progress, Lenin had created something he called new economic policy. And the idea was that people were able to trade, basically. They became entrepreneurs. And it wasn't a very Bolshevik idea, like not a very communist idea by nature. And so that's why it had quite a big opposition from the start. But Lenin, that was his idea. So he pushed it through. And many men, and Marcus along them, became the beneficiaries of that. So he started his own, I mean, business is a big word, but he started trading at the market. He had his own stall, and he was able to do his thing and bring money home, and it was all working out very well for him. Unfortunately, that didn't last, and after Lenin died and Stalin became the leader, he ruled that all the people who became known as netmen, who had contributed to the new economic policy, were enemies of the people. And that's where it kind of all started going wrong for Marcus, because netmen were there was a huge difference, a variety of what they did. Some did actually run huge businesses and enterprises where they employed their whole families, and others, like my great grandfather, only had a stall at the market. But the idea was the same. They were entrepreneurs, and they were, in the eyes of Stalin and the staunch Bolsheviks, they were enriching themselves, and that had to be eradicated. So Marcus was exiled, and my grandmother, she was still a child at the time. She was only 4 or 5, so the memories are difficult to kind of fix properly, but she thinks that that was the moment that broke him and completely changed his perspective, because he believed in the Soviet Union. He believed in the idea that of equality, of freedom for the people, of the abolition of aristocracy and everything. But in the end, it was those ideas that kind of that he suffered for, and that changed the course of his life. He was lucky, in a sense, in inverted commas, he was lucky that he wasn't sent to Siberia, to the gulags. He was only exiled to a different city, to Nizhny Novgorod, which in the huge expanse that is Russia, it's relatively not that far away, and he was able to receive visitors, but he wasn't able to live in the capital city, in Moscow, and he wasn't able to, and the whole family was stripped of all their possessions. And that was one of my grandmother's first memories, is walking, and that meant the flat as well. So they had to leave the flat where they were living. And that's one of her earliest memories, of walking across the courtyard of their neighborhood at the crack of dawn, on their way to their new place where they were going to live, that her mother had been able to kind of find at the last minute, to arrange for herself and her children to move to. But that very much influenced my grandmother. That was, of course, we now know, only the beginning. But I think I'm just going to jump a little bit, quite far forward, and say that when I was growing up in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, and I was very curious to know more about my family. And there were two things. First of all, the family. So the two brothers had stayed in touch in the very early years, and we had photos of Adolf's daughters that had been sent to us. And I'm going to show you. So this is, for example, Adolf's eldest daughter Ava, and her sister. Oh no, hold on, sorry. And this is her sister Genya. And so we had several of these photos that had been sent by Adolf to his brother Marcus in the 20s. And my grandmother, it was her treasured archive. Every now and then she would get it out and she would show it to us, always, in kind of big secrecy. It was always a big moment for her to talk about it. And I was fascinated by them. I always wanted to know who they were, what happened to them. These photos obviously taken in the early 30s. The women are very glamorous and very elegant, very different to kind of the Soviet photos that we had of our family. But the problem was that my grandmother didn't know very much. The letters had ceased, contact stopped. All contact became sporadic between the two families in the 30s, obviously, with the arrest of Marcus, exile of Marcus, and with the worsening situation of the crackdowns and repressions in the Soviet Union in the 30s. But also the problem is that my grandmother didn't actually know anything, because none of the letters had survived, so she couldn't reread them as an adult and try and actually learn of what had been going on. She just knew the names of her cousins, and that was it. So my curiosity was already kind of triggered by that. And the other thing I really wanted to know was about being Jewish, because that was another thing that my family didn't talk about. They talked about the fact that we were Jewish, and that was always very present and very, you know, this is a fact and this is a good thing, but this is something you have to keep quiet. This is something you can't tell anyone. And I think there was a lot of conflict within my grandmother, and I will tell you more about her life over the course of this talk, so you kind of understand the kind of the trauma that she had lived through, or the traumatic years that she had lived through. But I think, and I've heard from other friends, that this is quite a common experience of Jewish families who'd lived through various events, obviously. But I remember very clearly from my childhood of, you know, watching a performer or a pianist or a musician or something, and my grandmother saying, oh, you know, he is Jewish, this is really good, like, you know, you should listen to him. But then when I asked, I wanted to know, what does it mean? And what is a menorah that I had seen on the street? But I wasn't getting any of the answers. And again, that's partly because my family just didn't know, because of what they had lived through and all the repressions. But that kind of spurred me on. I wanted to know, and I didn't get to ask these questions until I moved to London. And that's when I kind of started putting things together and piecing together the story and looking into my family. So my experience has always been like this dual path of family and Jewish identity, culture, everything, you know, anything I could kind of learn about it. And that's how I came to look for the family. So contact had been sporadic from the 30s, obviously very difficult in the 40s and during the war. And in the 50s, both brothers died within 2 years of each other, and contact was completely lost. So that was it. And in my grandmother's kind of, my grandmother and my mother also grew up wondering about the Swiss family and what happened to them, and with this idea that life was better and easier in the West, and they used to dream of, you know, Switzerland, not really knowing anything about it at all. And I decided that it was time that we found them, and especially living in London, we moved here when in the year 2000, so it was a completely different time. So it was obviously much easier for me to make this decision. And so I went on the website called genie.com. It's a genealogy website. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. And the irony is that it only took less than an hour to actually find them. And I did this talk with the Jewish Genealogical Society, and I told them that it only took an hour, and they were, you know, it's a very different reaction, because obviously they are all the people who are fascinated in genealogy and spend years or decades searching for families. So I know that we were incredibly lucky that this happened, but they also happened to be on the same website. So we were very fortunate. And when I found the connection, I could see that it said we had to look by, so the brothers Adolf and Marcus's surname was Neyman, and which is obviously very common. So when I was doing the research on the website, I had to look by Adolf's wife's maiden name, because it's a lot less common, and actually got us the results that we were looking for. I learned that it was Adolf's granddaughter who had put all the information on the website. And so I contacted her. And that was a very emotional moment, because I didn't know what to expect. You know, it's someone that might not know. I didn't know if she would know that we existed, if she knew the story of her grandfather's brother who had gone to Russia. I didn't know anything, and I was very nervous that she would just reject the idea or would not be interested or anything like that. But we were very lucky, because it turns out that she replied within 24 hours, and we started arranging our first meeting, and we learned that at that point, so this was 10 years ago now, at that point her mother, Genya, Adolf's youngest daughter, was still alive, and she was 96. So we knew that the time wasn't on our side, and we had to make very quick arrangements for our first meeting, which is a whole kind of story on its own. I'm going to try and find the photo and show you. Oh, so first of all, I should probably show you a photo of my grandmother as she was. This is it. This is my grandmother during the war. So she's Marcus's daughter. And so when we were planning this meeting, so Ava, her first cousin, was 96 and my grandmother was 86. And this is their very first meeting. There you go. This is Ava, sorry, Genya on the left and my grandmother Anna on the right. And so it was a really emotional meeting for many reasons. But, you know, the main thing is that these two women, when they were little girls, and obviously there's quite a big age gap there, but when they were little girls, they both remember writing letters to each other. And they never thought that they would meet. And actually, we also learned that Ariane, when I contacted her, Genya's daughter, when I first contacted her, she admitted later that she didn't actually know anything about us, that she had to call her mother, Genya, and ask her. And it was only thanks to Genya, who was luckily at that point still, you know, very good memory and very good health, that she got really excited and she said, oh my goodness, you know, this is, I remember this uncle. I remember writing letters to him when I was a child. This is all true. And what they say in the message is absolutely true. And so obviously I think we would have, because Ariane, they are also very interested in family history. So I think we would have got there in the end anyway, because we found lots of photos and everything that we both have. But it was just really lucky that Genya was still around and could kind of connect the dots very quickly for us. And so we started planning this first meeting. And I thought actually that I would read you a couple of paragraphs just very briefly from the book about how that meeting went, because the other thing that we couldn't have anticipated is that the only language that the two cousins could speak together was German, because my grandmother learned German at school and at university and then spent her whole life teaching it as a foreign language in Moscow, whereas Genya was obviously born in the German speaking part of Switzerland and only later moved to Geneva, which is French speaking. But they tend to, especially that generation, they tended to all speak all the languages of Switzerland. So German ended up being the only language that they could really communicate in, and that was also amazing for them to be able to speak directly to each other without having to be translated. And the rest of us spoke English and French around them. So it really was quite a sight. So if anyone already has a copy of the book, it's on page 18, just if you wanted to follow. Neither Anna nor Eugenia ever expected to meet in person. When they finally came face to face, they just looked at each other, searching for physical signs of resemblance, signs that would tell everyone that they were first cousins, almost sisters. Anna's miniature frame paled in comparison to her older cousin, who had a more imposing presence. Together, they gave away a family trait that until then I had considered to be a beauty myth, an astonishing lack of wrinkles on their faces despite their age. As they sat together on the sofa, clasping hands and trying to find the right words for the occasion, it was an old German ballad that finally brought the tears and the sadness that both had felt since their meeting had become a possibility. They thought back to their childhoods and of the years gone by. They talked of what could have been had life not taken their fathers on such divergent paths, and they dreamt of having had a lifetime together. On the wall overlooking the living room, a portrait of Adolf hung in a beautiful frame of light brown oak, observing his daughter and his niece. He could not have foreseen that in the end, the two families would be reunited. And as you looked at his portrait, you could almost imagine his face breaking into a smile. Anna and Eugenia tried to make up for years of lost time. How do you get to know somebody you've known about your whole life but have never met? Do you start with their marriage or their best years? Do you talk about the children and the grandchildren and share the little details about your current life? You could also talk about the Second World War, some of the worst years you have both experienced, in the hope that sharing those moments might bring you closer. There is no right or wrong, no obvious solution. For Anna and Genya, as she is known in the family, there were whole decades to talk through. For a while, the conversation lingered in the air as the cousins were unable to take the plunge and settle on the most important, the most interesting, or the most urgent. At 86 years old, Anna didn't want to talk about herself. Again and again, she repeated that she'd had a difficult time when she was married, but it was even worse when she was on her own, and the Soviet Union was a terrible place to live. She was much more comfortable interrogating her cousin, trying to get the answers to as many questions as she could think of, and Genya, who at almost 97 was still happy to talk and tell stories as she had ever been, happily obliged. So that was the first meeting, and there's another photo which I wanted to show you is of everyone else, because obviously we were all there and they were the stars of the show, absolutely. But this is the rest of the family. So Genya is on the right here on the sofa, and my grandmother's on the left. And behind Genya, with her hand on her shoulder, is her daughter Ariane, who is the one I contacted first. And next to Ariane is Anita, who is Ava's daughter. So Ava obviously was quite a few years older than her sister and was no longer around by then. And behind Anita is a man with his glasses on his forehead. That's Ariane's half brother, so also Genya's son. And then if you come back down, you see next to Anita a lady in all black. That's my mother. And so those four people are the next generation down from Genya and Anna, and everyone else is my generation. So there was quite a few of us who were able to make it that first day. And it was definitely a very, very interesting experience, very emotional meeting, because I don't know if any of you have ever found new cousins or new family you had known about but had never met before. But you know, if you have, you will know that just because you're meeting family, it doesn't mean that you're gonna get on straight away, you're gonna click with them instantly. You know, it can go either way. I mean, they are people you've never met before, even though they're family on paper. It doesn't mean that it's gonna go well. So we were definitely very worried, because how was it going to go? But we were very lucky, and I still feel extremely privileged that this has happened, because they have become like my family. And you know, my grandmother is getting quite old now, and she's had she's quite a complicated person. She's quite negative in her approach to life, but at times feel that Ariane, who was, you know, the first one we contacted, who is she's the age of that age where she could be my grandmother, has almost become that person in a sense, because we've definitely developed a very strong bond, and she was instrumental in helping me write this book and making sure that I got all the family politics correct, and I wasn't going to, you know, I was still doing justice to the family but not offending anyone or getting anything wrong. So I definitely feel very, very lucky that this happened. But I also want to tell you a little bit more about Adolf and what happened to him after he moved, because his journey wasn't, I mean, it was a completely different experience. And in my family, there was always this belief that they were the lucky ones, the ones who ended up in Switzerland, and we were the unlucky ones that had drawn the short straw. And I suppose to an extent, it's also, you know, whether it's true or not, I don't know, because there's a lot that happened during the war. But I think what happened straight when Adolf moved in 1905, he started working for that watch factory, and he actually had a very good career out of it. He proved himself to be very entrepreneurial, a very good manager. And so by the time that the First World War was over, he was able to move his family to Geneva and set up his own watch factory. And that was a decision that was going to make a huge impact on his life, because, well, first of all, he became quite wealthy and quite a well-established figure in his community. And that money was very helpful to rescue his daughter. Just one instance that I can think of off the top of my head, but you know, he was able to rescue his daughter during the Second World War, because Ava had ended up living in Belgium. She had married into a Jewish Russian Jewish family who were living in Belgium. They were in Antwerp, they were diamond traders, and so she was under occupation, and eventually he was able to get her out with his connections. So that's definitely something that had an impact on his life. And but it was also very difficult for him because he had been very close to his brother, and even though we don't know why they went their separate ways and why Marcus didn't follow his brother when after Adolf had settled in Switzerland, you know, they did write to each other, and Adolf felt really bad that he couldn't actually help Marcus very much during the years that followed and when Marcus was in trouble and in the Soviet Union. And that's also quite ironic because you know, it was very dangerous for anyone in the Soviet Union to have contact with the outside world. And I think there isn't anything that Adolf could have actually done. And if anything, it was good that he didn't try, because if anything, it could have put Marcus in greater danger than he already, you know, more trouble than he was already in. But it was interesting because in my family, other than, you know, as I said, we didn't know very much about the Swiss branch, but we did know that there was a watch factory. And my mum always said to me afterwards that, you know, when she was growing up in the 60s and in the 70s, Soviet Union, when life was really difficult and there was not enough of anything, she used to think of her family in Switzerland and she would think of the watch factory. And it was always like a, you know, it was always like a myth. It's just such a stereotype to think of Switzerland and the watch factory, and could it really be true? So she almost didn't believe it. So it was really astonishing for us to find out that it had actually been true, and there was a factory, the watch factory, that he owned for many years, and then sold this family sold it much later. And it's that kind of belief. I think I became interested in this story through my mother, but it was only because of her curiosity and kind of optimism that generally about life, and that kind of transferred itself onto our family story. But I think it was only when we met the family and I started asking them questions, and what happened to you, and what happened to you, and kind of what happened to your family during the war, when I started to know their stories, that I could see that they were spanning. If I looked at a map of Europe, for example, they would span the whole of Europe. You know, you had my grandmother who was in Russia. She had been evacuated from Moscow during the war when the Germans started bombing the capital. And then on the other side, you had her cousin Ava, who was living in Belgium at the time, and Genya had actually married a Russian Jewish man in Palestine and moved to Tel Aviv in 1935. And so she spent the years of the Second World War in Tel Aviv, completely cut off from the rest of Europe, while her parents were in Geneva. So I started piecing together these stories, and it was astonishing to me that, you know, you have one family who had been spread out, and how their lives were so completely changed and altered by politics. You know, they were, you read so many of memoirs and, you know, Jewish books, and or not even Jewish, you know, just books about Second World War, about what happened and how history happened, but you really rarely hear about normal people who were just trying to live their lives, and what happened to me. And I think that was the trigger that made me want to write this book and actually tell the world about, you know, what happens when you're just trying to live your life and actually playing by the rules. You know, Marcus was following the official policy of becoming an entrepreneur, and he was punished just for that, and that impacted the rest of his life. So to me, it was really interesting to see how one family became so affected by all the political events and one major kind of event, i.e. the Second World War, from different sides. In Palestine, in Antwerp, and then Brussels when Ava moved, but also Switzerland, how Adolf was trying to help out and rescue his daughters, and on the other side in Russia. And the other thing that I was aware of when I was writing this is that I feel like I have had the unique position to be writing this book, because as I mentioned, I grew up in Moscow. I was 15 when I came here, and 15 is like quite an interesting age because you're no longer a child, you're not quite an adult. I'd done a lot of studying, obviously most of my schooling in Moscow, and a lot of the history that I was learning was Russian history and the Second World War as seen through Russian eyes. So it was all about the Battle of Stalingrad and the Siege of Leningrad and everything else. And I was astonished to kind of learn about D-Day landings and the Battle of Britain and everything else when I came here. But I think by the time I came to writing this book 10 years ago, I had already lived here for so long that I felt like I was straddling both sides. And so I could see both sides of the story. I could see both, you know, it wasn't the kind of the same approach that my mother and grandmother had when they talked about their family in Switzerland. For them, it was more like we were the victims and they got the easy life. I could definitely see it in a slightly different way, especially having learned of their journeys and what happened to them during the war years. So that was the other kind of reason why I wanted to see if, to tell these stories, because they're so fascinating. I'm just going to show you a couple more photos. I'm aware of the time, and I do want to make sure that you all get to ask your questions as well. One of the things about writing this book is all the research that I was able to do. And so this is a photo. So this is the engagement photo of Ava and Stanis, her husband. So he is the man from the Russian Jewish family who were living in Antwerp. And so this is the photo that was taken just before their wedding, which was in Geneva, just before they moved to Antwerp. And so the research that I was doing was actually very much influenced by Ava, because even though she's the only family member who I wasn't able to meet by the time I started, by the time we found them, she had kept a diary her whole life. And a lot of her diaries were written as she was living the events, but some of the pages she also wrote in hindsight as well, many years after the war. And I was very lucky that I was able to read those diaries, and that was definitely very helpful, because through those diaries, and I think those are maybe some of the most dramatic pages in the book, they tell the story of how she lived under occupation in Belgium, first in Antwerp and later in Brussels. And I think for me personally as well, for the reasons I've already mentioned, you know, how I grew up in Russia and definitely kind of got more of Russian history. But I think I obviously also studied history, like, you know, after I'd moved here, and I read a lot of books, so I understood the bigger picture, so to speak, the bigger picture that I wasn't necessarily taught in Russia. But what I never realized until meeting my Swiss family and connecting with Ava's diaries is how much I would feel that if that story of the occupation and the West, the Holocaust as well, how much that was part of my family directly. Because to me, learning about those stories, and there's a particularly dramatic chapter in the book where Ava and Stanis and their daughter Anita get caught up in near Dunkirk during the occupation dynamo as Dunkirk, as all the British troops are being evacuated from Dunkirk. And that was particularly striking because I'd learned about the battle of about Operation Dynamo and the evacuation of Dunkirk. I just never thought that my personal family history would have anything to do with it. But suddenly I was there reading those very dramatic pages of her diary, of how they were escaping, how they were fleeing with all the other refugees that had got stranded on the beaches. And I suddenly felt very much connected. So that was also definitely a personal journey for me to be able to discover this. So I'm definitely very grateful to have had access to these diaries, to have been able to learn everything that Ava had experienced. And it helped reflect on all the different events that had occurred with her sister, for example, Genya, because obviously she talks about those, and it just gets the family politics, so to say, from a different angle. So I wasn't relying on different sources. And I think the last thing I would like to say about the book, and as a personal kind of inspiration before I hand over to you for your questions, is that what's really amazing about this story is that it so happens that all the main characters of this book are women. And I think it's just really, you know, it really gives us a glimpse into what life was like for different women in different circumstances in different parts of Europe throughout the 20th century, because the lives they led were very different. You know, Ava and Ava was in Brussels, Genya was in Palestine, my grandmother was in Moscow. Some of them had more better access to resources, others struggled a lot more. And, you know, I often ask that question of my grandmother. I would say to her, you know, did you think about this and did you think about that? And I think when she reflected on the slightly harder years of Soviet repressions or just deprivation, of fear, of paranoia that she had witnessed, she always said to me, you know, we didn't have time to kind of ponder the big thoughts or really wonder what would happen. Like, we just had to get on with it, to you know, to make do, to survive, and to make sure that there was food on the table for our children, and that we were kind of free, in a sense that we were free to live our lives, not imprisoned or anything, to avoid all the potential, you know, all the trouble spots that were so prevalent in the Soviet Union, all the possible things that could have gone wrong. So I hope I've been able to give you a flavour of the book and what it's about. And I'd like to hand over, I think David's going to moderate the Q&A. So please do let me know if there's anything you would like me to kind of go into further. Thank you. Hello?
I've asked you to unmute, David.
I couldn't. Yeah, no, I couldn't find my product thing. Well, I've got so much to ask you. I don't know really where to start. I mean, you can speak ahead for hours and hours. But can I just go back to when you were 15? How long did it take you before you knew that you were leaving, till you actually left? And did you want to leave? Because you were educated there, you had all your friends there, not so much of family, I would assume. But did you actually want to leave?
No, I was 13 when I found out. And I mean, I know I have kids of my own now. I mean, they're only small, but I already know not to really ask them anything, just tell them what to do. So no, I was told when I was 13 that we were going, and I was very unhappy. I didn't want to go. I had my friends, as you said, but you know, they kind of asked me, but they weren't asking me. They were telling me, and we moved, and it was really tough because 15 is a very tough age. But at the end of the day, I think my parents made the right decision, and I'm very grateful to them that, you know, I'm here and I've had all the opportunities that I've had, because Russia at the time, you know, the story of our moving is not particularly interesting. My parents had the opportunity, the possibility to get out. My dad actually still lives in Russia back and forth. So we didn't we didn't burn all the bridges. You know, we were living in 2000. By then it was more or less okay to come and go, and I go back whenever I want to. So it's a kind of a different story to what you might hear from, you know, friends or family who kind of left earlier. But my parents had this opportunity to bring us here mainly for like education purposes and quality of life, and that's what they did. And I'm definitely very very grateful to them. But no, I didn't want to go.
And was London your first place? I mean, or did you have a choice?
Well, my parents, yeah, they deliberated for quite a while. They looked at different options, but in the end it was London, yeah, for various like quite prosaic reasons, you know, visas and citizenships and passports. Like it's really not particularly interesting, especially in the grand picture of, you know, people moving country all the time. It's not really one of those kind of interesting immigrant experiences at all.
You came directly to London?
Yeah.
And what did you think of London when you first arrived here? It must be quite an eye-opener.
Yeah, but I mean, look, it's a big city, but so is Moscow. So, you know, I wasn't phased. I was used to Moscow. I went to school in the center of Moscow, and then we moved to the suburbs of London. So actually, in a sense, it was much quieter, and London was not very familiar, but I had been used to coming here on holiday, you know, in the summer, and you're learning English in like various language schools. And it was great. I mean, I missed my friends. I wanted to make sure I learned English as well as I could. because I knew that I had to, I wanted to be a journalist already. So I knew that if I was going to become a journalist, I had to kind of make sure I could speak some English. So I kind of continued with that. But yeah, it took a couple of years to get used to, but it was great.
But you're pleased now bringing
Yeah,
up family
no,
involved.
absolutely, of course. I
Couldn't
mean,
you
given
couldn't-
the political situation, it is only getting worse by the day. It's yeah.
And where was that photo taken with all your family?
That was in Geneva. That was at our first meeting. So we went to them, and that was in Ariane's house when she welcomed us.
And they were obviously all, I mean, were they living in Russia and came out like you, or were they all born here?
No, so they were all born in Switzerland. Well, actually, I mean, I say that they're all Swiss, but obviously Ariane herself had been born in Tel Aviv in 1937, and she came to Switzerland. They moved to Switzerland in 1945. So Genya had really had a bad time of it during the war because her husband enlisted with the British Army. He was a doctor, so he spent most of the war years and more years after the war was over with the British Armed Forces. And she was left on her own, and it was a city that she didn't know. She had her expat friends and they kind of had a good time when they could, but it was really tough for her with no news from her family, and all the letters that were arriving from Europe, they were all censored, and she obviously kind of had heard rumors of what was happening. So she was particularly worried for her family, her sister in Brussels. So when she could, in 1945, she got on the first ship out of Palestine and came back, and divorced her husband and later remarried. So Ariane was born in Tel Aviv, and then Anita herself had been born in Antwerp when her mother Ava was living there, and was miraculously rescued by the by the Red Cross, who were taking children out of Brussels under the occupation. So she was taken out of Brussels and brought to Switzerland to her grandparents while her mother and father were still in occupied Belgium during the war. But then everyone else, there's the Swiss, they're completely Swiss, Geneva kind of residents, and we speak French. I'm lucky that I'd learned French at school and university as well, so I can speak French to them, and they speak really good English. So we've kind of we do that, but no, they have no Russian connections at all, actually. So, and I think back in the day, everyone spoke all sorts of different languages. We know for a fact that Adolf and Marcus both spoke Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. And then by the time they were sending letters from Switzerland, so by the time Adolf and his family was sending letters to Marcus, they were signing them in French and German. So my grandmother doesn't remember her father speaking any French, but or German, actually. But I think the girls, her cousins, were writing in French and German because they didn't speak Polish or Yiddish or Russian. So I think being multilingual at the time for Jewish families was quite normal. You picked up all languages where you lived and spoke all the others on top of it. So yeah.
So you're the generation, your generation.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them were born outside of Russia.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So no, my sister and I are the only ones who were born in Russia, but then the Swiss branch, they were all in Switzerland.
You didn't have family or cousins or?
On the other side, yeah, not this kind of branch of the family, but I was just thinking to the other photos that I haven't shown you when I was doing, I mentioned all the photos that were sending back and forth. So we had photos of the Swiss branch, and I was really curious to know, after we'd connected all the dots and we knew that we were definitely one family, I was really curious to see what photos they had of our family, or maybe I could discover some photos that I didn't know existed. And so on one of my trips to Geneva, I was staying with Ariane, and she had to, she was busy one particular afternoon, and she said to me, look, here is a whole cupboard full of photo albums, of family photo albums. I have to leave for a couple of hours, but why don't you go through all the albums and maybe you'll find what you're looking for. And at that point, I didn't really know what to expect, but I think that particular afternoon, I still get shivers down my spine when I think about it. But that I found 2 photos, which are the biggest kind of treasure of our family album at the moment. One of them is that photo from the cover that I showed you at the beginning of the 2 brothers.
Yeah.
And we think that it was taken just before they left in 1905. It was their final kind of goodbye at the photo studio. But there's another photo there that I found, and I was absolutely astonished because this photo dates from 1891. And
Wow.
this is the photo, this is the first time. So this is Adolf and Marcus as children. Marcus is younger, Adolf is older. But this also shows their parents. And this was the very first time that I had ever seen my great-great-grandparents. So their father was called Nachman and their mother was called Hannah. And this is the first time, and I found this photo, and there is another story connected to it, because we think this was also kind of a final goodbye moment photo, because the father had actually left the family and went to America in search of fortune and better life, etc., and said to them, you know, I will settle down and I will send for you. And then he never did, and they never heard from him. So I think this was like the final photo that they took all together before he left. But it was absolutely amazing to be able to find this and to have it in our family archive. I think not a lot of families can. I mean, yeah, very grateful that it survived. And I didn't know, I mean, even because Ariane didn't even know she had it, because those were the photo albums of her Aunt Ava that she had inherited. And obviously, you know, she must have had it from from Adolf, who'd brought it over with him. So that was probably one of the biggest discoveries of writing this book, of this writing process, is being able to find such information.
The photo of that, the quality of that photo is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of the photos that we've got, we can't even see them anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it was you know, when you keep something in an album and it doesn't get opened for decades and then you completely forget it's there, that's the advantage. Now it's been scanned properly, so hopefully we'll have it for many years to come untouched. But absolutely.
Okay. Can I digress a little bit? You've done an enormous amount of research for the whole of a century, isn't it? Basically, it's 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a mammoth task. Not only in terms of where you begin, but where do you stop?
Yeah, that was very difficult, actually. So the book came out in November last year, and I think the very last trip that I took was in February last year. So at the very last minute, I was like, right, this is still got, you know, I have more to find out. So my third cousin, actually, Ariane's daughter, and I went together to that village in Switzerland where Adolf first moved to. It's called Grenchen. It became a center of watchmaking. A lot of factories are based around there, but at the time it wasn't like that at all. It was completely transformed in the last 100 years. But we decided, I always knew that I wanted to see it, and I was like, right, this is it. We didn't know the pandemic was coming at that point, so that was kind of the last hurrah. And we made that trip, and we found Adolf's name in some of the old archive books that registered people coming and going, so that was really interesting as well. But I mean, look, yeah, it's a mammoth project, and it took many years to put it all together. All the interviews that I did, I interviewed endlessly all my family members. I don't know how they put up with me. I talked to them, I transcribed everything, I typed it up, I went back for more. But I also tried to cross-check everything. And I think that's where my training as a journalist came in. You know, I had to kind of make sure that whatever they were telling me was also right, because, you know, memory is very fickle. You might remember something even from last week, let alone 6-7 decades ago, that might be remembered differently by two different people who were both present. So I knew that I had to verify everything. And so I spent a lot of time going through historic documents that I could find, also reading other history books and other memoirs and other books just set in the same kind of time, or other stories, just to see that everything that my family were telling me, that memory had kind of like not they hadn't mistaken anything in their memories. And I also worked with historians to make sure that, because one thing I learned is that history is actually, I mean, obviously it's complicated and it's not black and white, but actually there's a lot of disputed elements to it that historians kind of still don't really agree on, and what happened, and especially around the Second World War, and what happened first, and how which event kind of led to what, and what influenced things. So I worked with historians as well to make sure that I had all the facts, and it was all kind of presented in the proper way, because yeah, I really wanted it to be accurate, to be able to kind of do it justice and not exaggerate or mislead anything anywhere. And it was through my work with one of the Russian historians actually that I was also able to learn one of the most kind of amazing facts about Marcus, my great-grandfather, that my grandmother didn't know, is that when he was in the Imperial Army, he was a decorated soldier. He didn't get a high rank, but he was decorated 3 times for bravery, and he had 3 medals, and those records were found by the historian in the Russian archives. And that was really interesting because, I mean, my grandmother obviously didn't know about it, and I think that's because after the war ended, the Russian Empire ceased to exist as well. So once the Soviet Union was created, my great-grandfather didn't want to advertise any of his imperial achievements. And I think that's probably why he kept it quiet. But it was a really interesting kind of addition to getting to know him and what kind of a man he was, and what he kind of became during his years in the army. So that was really interesting. So yeah, I think definitely very, very extensive research, and I'm really pleased that it kind of all came together in the end.
Absolutely. Actually, I've been holding you the whole evening. I've been a bit selfish. Are there any questions out there?
So if people want to put questions into the chat, I'll relay them. Or if you want to put your virtual hand up, then we can open your line for you to ask your questions directly.
Nadia, it's very interesting. I just wonder, at what point did you realise there was a history going back to your great-grandparents?
Well, I mean, I always knew about Adolf, because I think, you know, how I mentioned that my mother and my grandmother always, like, you know, viewed them as the lucky relatives. So we always talked about the Swiss family, and my grandmother always spoke about her uncle Adolf with great admiration. You know, he was a very clever, wise, etc. man. So I always kind of wondered what that was all about. But I think, yeah, I think it's when I started discovering the particular experiences that I thought, oh, this is really interesting. You know, this is one family. And on one side of the family, my grandmother was evacuated from Moscow to Ufa, which is like towards the border with Kazakhstan during the Second World War. And on the other side, her cousin was living in Palestine, which is like completely opposite, completely different experiences. And I've always really been into history, and I liked reading history books. So I really kind of wanted to explore that.
And what about learning about your own great-grandfather as opposed to Adolf?
That was a lot harder because he'd spent part of my grandmother's childhood in exile. So obviously her relationship with him suffered as a result. He eventually came back when she was older. He was allowed to come back to Moscow. He was allowed to get a job, like move back in with his family and everything. And that was all fine. And he did. And but, you know, he was a completely broken man by then. His idealism of his youth had been kind of ruined and destroyed. And there was a lot of fear and paranoia, and people just didn't talk openly about a lot of things. And my grandmother her mother even, you know, Marcus's wife, was terrified of what this might mean. Might the authorities be watching them closely now that her husband had come back? No one really knew what to expect. And the other thing is that we were talking, David, earlier about in the Soviet Union, there was this, in your identity documents, in your internal passport, there was this bit where it had your nationality, whether ethnicity, effectively. And, you know, I did say that my grandmother's obviously was stated that she was Jewish, but there was another thing that was kind of omnipresent in the Soviet life. It was this questionnaire that you had to fill out, a questionnaire, whatever you did, whether you were applying for a new job or you were starting your degree at the university or going to school, you had to fill out an extensive questionnaire. And the more kind of the more the higher ranking the job, or the more kind of important the position you were going for, the more elaborate the questionnaire was. And my grandmother was filling one out for when she was applying to go to university. And one of the questions on it was, was anyone in your family ever exiled and arrested? And she knew that if, compared to that question, her Jewish ethnicity on her passport was, nothing, because if she had said yes, if she had revealed that her father had been exiled, that would have been the end of her life, because she was the daughter of someone who had been exiled, and that was a black stain on her file. So she had a choice to make. Either she lies basically and says no, or she says yes. And most people in situations like this, they lied, because obviously technology wasn't quite there to double check extensively, all the millions of people in the Soviet Union. So she lies and said no, and she was able to go into university. And this is just kind of to illustrate the kind of fear and the paranoia that people were living in. And I was going through some of her old kind of archives with her while I was interviewing her, and she has loads of photos, and a piece of paper fell out of one of her bags. And I opened it, and it was like one of the really old, written in the 30s when she was a young woman, maybe in the early 40s. And it was a job application, like a cover letter. And so she writes, she's fairly young at the time, so she wasn't much to write. I went to this school, and then I went to, I studied this and that. And then at the end of that cover letter, it was only 2 pages long, it says, I do not have any relatives abroad. So that was something that she had to make a point of, but that was another lie. And so, this is just a lie of like a life of moral choices, moral compromises that you had to make with yourself, that either you just lie outright and you hope for the best and you hope not to be found out, which in her case worked, to be able to have a life. Because if you tell the truth, then either you're just completely blacklisted from everything, or you're arrested, even worse, so that you're completely, ruining it for yourself. So I think the relationship with her father obviously suffered. And when I tried to talk to her about how she felt when he died and how she felt just generally about his life, it was very striking, actually, that what she wanted to talk to me in response to that question was the death of Stalin, because Stalin died a year after her father. And she said there was a big tragedy that her father didn't live long enough to see Stalin die, because Stalin was responsible for all the, in her eyes, and in a massive generalization, obviously, but he was responsible for all the ills that had befallen her father and everything that he had suffered. And so that was really striking to me. She didn't really have very much to kind of say about that.
I can understand why people would lie on the forms. It's not like there isn't any corruption in Russia.
Yeah.
I've been to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was very much easier to get around and to walk around. Moscow, I felt very uncomfortable and could tell the corruption there.
How long ago was that, David?
I was there in Moscow 2011 and St. Petersburg 2012. It may have been the years before that. I was there on business. So
they're very different cities. St. Petersburg was built by Peter the Great. It was built to be a European city, a window into Europe. He modeled it on all the great European cities. So it's a very different feel to it. Moscow is a kind of Asiatic capital of Russia. It was built over the years, and it has a very different feel to St. Petersburg.
Yes, one abiding memory I have from Moscow was trying to cross the road, one particular road, which was about 8 lanes each way. And it was a bit like being on a Grand Prix circuit. When the lights changed green, you took your life in your hands. And all the roads had these underpasses below them so that you wouldn't get knocked over. But just moving on, and obviously it's a current thing in this country, more so than it has been previously. Did you encounter much anti-Semitism in Russia?
I personally didn't. My parents did in different ways, and kind of more passive and sometimes more active. I don't know. I think, but I think generally, if you look at kind of my family, I think anti-Semitism wasn't the bigger concern. It was the kind of, during the Soviet years, it was more the kind of the paranoia and the fear and the repressions, and knowing that people were telling on each other and reporting each other to the authorities. I mean, yeah, of course there was anti-Semitism, and like my dad didn't get into the university of his choice because of his very Jewish surname. But I don't feel like in this particular story, it's like an outstanding factor. I think.
No, I can understand that. There's obviously anti-Semitism here. Personally,
No, of course.
I don't think I've suffered anti-Semitism on a personal level more than 3 times in my entire life, and probably not at all in the last 30 years. And
No, and I mean, neither have
people
I.
don't.
No, and I've lived in, and if anything, I think I lived in Paris. Well, that was 10 years ago now, but when I lived in Paris, I think it was more visible than it is to me right now. But then again, it is very much dependent on the kind of, on where you are and what kind of life you lead, I think. And obviously I see a lot of it on social media. But I think what's interesting, actually, what I've learned about Russia and the Soviet Union and anti-Semitism while I was writing this book and doing my research, and what really struck me is that I've always kind of wondered why Marcus didn't change his name, because when he moved from Warsaw, he abandoned all his aspects of Jewish life. You know, he grew up a Jewish boy on the streets of Jewish Warsaw, but then when he moved to Moscow, he left it all behind. My grandmother has never been to a synagogue because her parents never took her. Her father never talked about anything. She kind of, you know, she speaks German, so she could understand her parents when they were speaking Yiddish to each other, and every now and then she would remember some kind of Jewish dish that her mother cooked. But generally speaking, it was a completely kind of assimilated life. And I've always wondered, and what was really interesting that I learned during the writing of this book is actually, and this makes total sense, but when Soviet Union was created, by many Jews from the former Russian Empire, it was seen as a clean break. You know, when Marcus went east to Moscow, that was a much more common path than to go west to Switzerland like Adolf did. Loads of Jews had first enlisted in the Imperial Army and then went to the bigger cities where they could get jobs. They didn't have to do only the certain jobs that they were allowed to do by the Russian Empire, in the Pale of Settlement. They could be whatever they wanted, and they weren't judged just for being Jewish. And I think that was the clean break that Marcus wanted. And for the first kind of few years of the Soviet Union in the 20s, it was definitely working because there weren't any problems. Anti-Semitism wasn't an official, I mean, far from it. Everyone was equal. Every Soviet citizen was seen to be a free man and equal in society. And all the problems only started later in the 30s, really. So that was something that I thought was really interesting, because now when we talk about the Soviet Union, we kind of, you know, anti-Semitism, especially like Jewish experience of the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism was always there. But it was interesting to go back to the beginning and see how it all started.
Yeah, because I mean, anti-Semitism, I mean, if we go back to my grandparents and great-grandparents, this is where we all came from. And we came from Russia, and they were thrown out, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
They were allowed to get out. I mean, with the pogroms, it must have been the most awful time.
They weren't all thrown out, David. My grandparents left Łódź in Poland in 1913. My father was 2 at the time, and they left there, but they left there to come to England. They just believed that it was a better state. Mind you, getting out of Europe in 1913 was probably quite a good move.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, okay. Right, before you talk about your book, and you can have a little advert, you might sell a few. I've just got one other quickie question for you, unless somebody else wants to say something. How did you balance between subjective memories and staying true to history?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely something that was at the back of my mind when I was writing it, because memory is fickle. And I even put a quote from Marcel Proust, who I always forget what it is, but he says memory, what is it? Hold on, let me find it. Oh, where is it? Oh, I don't remember where it is now, but memory of things past is not as as it was, or something along those lines. But basically to say that, you know, memory, just because we remember things in a certain way, it's not necessarily how it actually happened. And I think it's very fair. So I had to go back and forth quite a bit and make sure that everyone was kind of reflecting I mean, I had to let them be free with their memories, but also what I found is that the experience of interviewing different people is also very different, because some people remember facts and other people remember emotions. So my grandmother, for example, she remembers facts and nothing but facts. So it was quite tricky sometimes just to get her to like take a deep breath and say, okay, I know this is really hard, but can you, and with her actually almost never worked, because she's a very kind of particular person, and I always felt like she was telling me the things that she wanted to say and nothing else. But then on the other side in Switzerland, Ariane, for example, is a very emotional person. So with her, it was all emotion and all the stories of you know, she had a very traumatic experience of leaving Palestine when she was a child, leaving Tel Aviv, and she kind of never forgot that. And so it was all emotion and how attached she is to Israel, and a lot fewer facts than I kind of needed for my story. So with her, it was a lot of trying to go back and find out what I can pin down factually from her stories, and then kind of going back to her and say, okay, well, was this happening, and trying to kind of trigger her memory a bit more. But I had to find an approach to everyone, because everyone's different and everyone remembers things differently.
Would you like to give an advert for your book?
Yes. Well, I mean, one thing, I do have this little slate that I share with the name of my website, but also to say, yes, there are all the links for purchasing the book on the website, and if you do, I would be very, very happy. But also I have all the photos on my website, all the family archive, as many as I could upload are there as well. The old photos that I have shown you, some of the photos that are in the book, but also many, many more of all the different family members and all their different experiences. So if you're into family history and genealogy and old photographs, it's definitely worth checking out. I've really tried to make sure everything's explained, and there's lots of different articles about the book and everything.
Who published the book?
I actually self-published it. I'm an independent author. I did it myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is it only available through Amazon?
No, it's available on Amazon, but you can also request it from your local bookshop.
Right.
You can.
Okay, so it's pre-printed then. It's not.
No, it's print on demand. But you know, the print on demand technology is so outstanding at the moment that it doesn't really take very much at all. So it's also on Waterstones and Foyle's websites, and bookshops can order it. So it's everywhere. Whatever is your preferred method of getting.
Did it take you long to write? How long did it take?
Altogether, it took 7 years. But I always say, with a caveat, I did have 2 children in those 7 years as well. So it's like 3 children, you know, 2 children and the third child of the book. It all kind of happened at the same time. So, but you know, all the visits, I tried to visit every place. I went to Tel Aviv, and I went and looked at the streets where Ariane grew up, and I went I went to Geneva, and I went to Antwerp and Brussels and Warsaw, and I wanted to kind of live those experiences and see where my family had been and what's left. So I really wanted to kind of not rush it, but do it justice.
I remember there was a place I kept passing in Moscow where it reminded me of my grandmother's cooking, because on the menu, and it turned out I had an interpreter with me, and she would tell me what the different things were. And I think the chain of restaurants is called Yolki Polki or something.
Oh, yeah, it's a very popular one, yeah.
And they had things, you know, there's meatballs with rice and things that look like cholent and various other things. They're just like home cooking.
It's a really popular chain, actually. Yeah, I've been there.
Great name as well.
Yeah.
Okay, David, shall we? Of course, it's gone 9:10. It's getting dark. So do you want to wind it up?
Nadia, thank you very much for being here this evening with the most interesting story and fascinating. I find that it's extremely rare, and I've mentioned it to people previously that we know who our grandparents are, but very rarely you'll find somebody who knows where their great-grandparents were. And in fact, if you turn around to most people and say, where are your great-grandparents buried, they probably have no idea. And unfortunately, though, as the generations pass, the generations prior to that are forgotten. In so many cases, it's lovely that you should have a book that you can then pass on to your children and your grandchildren in the future, who will be able to see about their ancestors and see the pictures. And to have an image of that, I think, is wonderful, because many of us, and probably most of us, don't have such an insight into the past. So that's really nice. So thank you for sharing your book with us this evening. I wish you continued success in the sales of it, and obviously in everything else that you do. I'd like to thank everybody else for being here this evening with us. And if I could mention that next week we have, from the Foundation for Jewish Heritage, we have Dame Helen Hyde, DBE, and Michael Mayle, who will be with us next week, and particularly interesting talk. And the week after that, in 2 weeks' time, we have Marie van der Zijl joining us. And she has just been re-elected president of the Board of Deputies, and we shall be the first people to have an interview with her since her re-election. So just going back, thank you again, Nadia. As I say, most interesting.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.